Okay, let's dive in. You've shared some sources with us, including excerpts from this piece called The Forever Wars. And today, yeah, that's exactly what we're going to unpack. Ever feel like you're reading about conflicts that just, well, it never seem to end? They feel fundamentally different from the wars we learned about in history class, right? Our mission in this deep dive is really to zero in on the core arguments, the insights presented in the material you've shared with us, and specifically this perspective offered in The Forever Wars.
And this particular piece, it really grapples with a central question, doesn't it? Why do some modern conflicts appear to persist indefinitely, lacking the clear conclusions of past wars? And what specific factors does the source argue are the reasons behind it?
Yeah, and we're going to look at some pretty sharp takes here. Like, this source's strong distinction between policing and military action. That's quite something. And a provocative idea about how external criticism might actually hinder effectiveness. Plus some incredibly specific anonymous examples from the text that illustrate decisions the author claims actively prolonged conflicts.
Get ready.
Because this perspective offers a very, very distinct lens.
It certainly does. It presents a specific viewpoint.
So jumping right in then, how does this piece define what a forever war actually is? What's its core characteristic according to this source?
Well, according to this analysis, a forever war is a conflict that drags on for a long time, where crucially the declared enemy is not destroyed. And this holds true, the source argues, even if one side possesses vastly superior military power. It's a conflict without that definitive end where the opposing force is eliminated or, surrenders unconditionally.
No clear win or loss, basically.
Right. And the fundamental reason offered by the source is quite pointed. It suggests a nation is unwilling to accept a certain level of destruction and casualties that would be necessary, perhaps, to achieve that decisive victory. Because of this unwillingness, they simply refuse or fail to properly destroy the enemy. The author uses an analogy that really sticks. Imagine having a huge, incredibly advanced military, but then choosing not to unleash its full capabilities. This reluctance, the piece suggests, paradoxically allows a smaller, weaker force to survive and, take advantage.
That comparison to having a powerful military but holding back.
Yeah.
It's striking. It's a big contrast when you think about a historical conflicts. This source specifically brings up World War II, right? How does it compare that kind of war to these forever wars?
Exactly. This perspective contrasts the current situation with something like WWII, where there was a widely accepted winner and loser because the losing side either surrendered completely or was effectively destroyed. There was a clear, albeit devastating, conclusion.
A defined end state.
Precisely. And here's where the source makes a significant critique. It argues that civilians managing military operations are fundamentally misunderstanding the nature of war. They're confusing police work with military action.
Ah, okay. That distinction again.
Yes, and this piece really spells out the distinction it sees. Police work, it says, is designed to apprehend individuals using the least lethal force possible, thinking of pepper spray, tasers, batons, with a firearm as an absolute last resort. Military action, on the other hand, this source defines solely as destruction aimed at achieving capitulation. Its purpose is to destroy the enemy until they surrender or are completely incapacitated. Very different goals.
Okay, so if the military objective, by this definition, should be destruction.
Mhm.
What does the source say is preventing that in modern conflicts? It mentions cameras and criticism.
Yeah.
That seems, counterintuitive on the surface.
It does, doesn't it? This source argues that in previous wars, the extensive visual documentation, cameras recording the destruction of lives and property, led to significant public criticism, backlash. And according to this analysis, that criticism had a profound effect. It resulted in the creation of new rules of engagement. Now, the author's controversial argument is that these rules weren't designed to enable victory, but rather to restrain military efficiency. The piece suggests they prioritize what it labels, maybe a bit sarcastically, good criticism over battlefield effectiveness.
So looking good is prioritized over winning, according to this view.
That seems to be the implication here. The source views this as introducing a new level of incompetence. While these rules might be framed as morally upright or appealing to the public, the author contends that the ultimate cost is higher. More people end up dying pointlessly because the conflict isn't brought to a decisive, swift conclusion.
More people will die for nothing because efficiency is being constrained. That leads directly into this source's point about not consolidating gains, doesn't it? What does the author mean by that lack of consolidation?
Yeah, it flows directly. It describes this pattern of fighting, maybe seizing ground, but then leaving the area without actually eliminating or destroying the entire opposition force. You haven't finished the job, essentially. The source points out that the surviving force, though weaker, is then free to regroup and often comes back into power or control after the stronger force departs.
So you win the battle, but then just leave.
Pretty much. The consequence, this piece argues, is that because the job wasn't finished decisively, no lasting legacy is established. Nothing permanent changes on the ground. And, adding to the problem, often no formal peace treaty is signed with that returning opposing force, which this source sees as an open invitation for hostilities to resume later. It's left unresolved.
And how does this pattern, fighting, but then leaving without a decisive end, impact relationships with other countries? The source talks about eroding credibility. How does that work?
Well, it argues that when a stronger force retreats without ensuring the enemy is destroyed, local populations who might have supported that stronger force are frequently persecuted or killed. They're left vulnerable. This, the piece suggests, severely damages that stronger nation's credibility with potential future allies over time, who would trust you next time.
Right.
The source gives a pretty concrete, though hypothetical, example. If you later ask another country for permission to use their airspace for transit or military action, they might well refuse. This source interprets such a refusal as that country essentially saying, look, you aren't reliable, you abandoned those who helped you before, we're better off staying out of it and relying only on ourselves, just like you left previous countries exposed. Makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah, you can see the logic there from that perspective. This piece also seems to identify specific justifications or excuses it believes are used to prolong these conflicts. What are some of those the source flags?
This analysis flags several recurring themes it views as rationalizations, maybe even excuses. One is claiming consideration for the suffering of civilians, which the source frankly calls a lie behind rhetoric, implying it's not the true primary driver for the lack of decisive action.
Okay, that's a strong claim. What else?
Well, the source poses a very pointed question. How can a war truly be underway if fundamental infrastructure, bridges, roads, communication networks, power grids is still functioning? The author argues that even industries capable of being repurposed for wartime production often remain intact, suggesting a less than total commitment to destruction. Like, are you really at war if the lights are still on everywhere?
Interesting point.
Other patterns this source notes include only controlling part of a territory like the north or east while leaving the rest to the enemy, a sort of stalemate by choice. And then using the excuse that a mighty power behind the borders is preventing total action. The source says this often leads to fighting by proxy, describing it as inviting and degrading the opposing force on the terrain rather than confronting the actual backers directly.
Fighting someone else's fight, almost.
Exactly. And this piece explicitly states that hearing phrases like fighting by proxy or excuses about a mighty power behind borders are, in its view, clear signals that you're likely entering a decade-long forever war. Those are the red flags it points to.
Those are very specific warning signs offered by this source. It also details what it considers ineffective tactics that contribute to dragging these wars out. Can you share some of those?
Yes, the source points to leaders destroying only some key infrastructure, and often only seemingly when they are provoked or angry, framing it as making you pay for what you have done today, like a punishment, not strategy. The author questions whether this is genuine warfare if the enemy is still allowed to operate, flourish, and produce weapons. It suggests it's more about symbolic punishment than strategic annihilation. Is it war or just punitive action?
And the source provides a really specific, anonymous example related to a bridge, doesn't it? That really highlighted the point.
It does, yeah. The source describes a recent conflict scenario involving a crucial bridge. Standard military doctrine, it notes, would dictate destroying such a strategic asset immediately. Obvious move, right?
You think so?
However, in this case, the stronger force did not destroy the bridge. For whatever reason, the order wasn't given or wasn't carried out. The consequence, according to the source's analysis, was significant. The weaker force was then able to use that bridge to move trains and heavy equipment, which caused substantial damage and casualties for the stronger force. They basically used the bridge against them.
Wow.
Ultimately, the source argues, that decision not to destroy the bridge allowed the weaker force to be reinforced and dig in with concrete and metal fortifications. The author directly attributes the war lasting another year without achieving significant strategic results to this specific, seemingly small non-decision, a huge impact from inaction.
That bridge example is incredibly illustrative of the source's argument about specific choices prolonging conflicts. It gives another anonymous story, too, highlighting restrictions and how the enemy adapted. Right.
Right. This piece recounts what it says is a true videotaped account from a conflict. It pitted a stronger force, equipped with tanks, helicopters, and jets, against a weaker force armed primarily with rifles and shoulder-fired rockets. A clear mismatch on paper.
Okay.
The key detail, according to the source, is that the stronger force operated under explicit restrictions not to destroy property.
Not to destroy property in the war zone.
Exactly. The stated reason, the source says, was concern that destroying buildings would leave refugees with nowhere to return. A humanitarian concern, ostensibly. So instead of using overwhelming firepower to clear areas, the orders were to go door to door, clearing structure by structure. Much slower and much more dangerous for the soldiers involved.
I can imagine.
The source reports that the stronger force began taking casualties under these restrictions. And critically, the enemy quickly understood the constraints the stronger force was under. They weren't stupid. They developed a tactic. Engaged the stronger force for just around 10 minutes, knowing heavy weapons wouldn't be deployed because of the property rule. Then quickly vanish without suffering casualties, only to reappear and repeat the tactic later. Hit and run, basically.
Violating the rules.
Precisely. This tactic, the source notes, was particularly effective in populated areas because the weaker force knew the stronger force was heavily restricted. Officers could even face court-martial for violating the no property destruction orders, while they themselves had no such limitations. The source uses a really stark phrase to describe the stronger force's predicament, saying they didn't know who the enemy was until fired upon, feeling like ducks with heavy weapons they couldn't use because of the rules. Hamstrung.
It sounds like this source is presenting a strong case that these kinds of decisions, driven by various factors it identifies, are central to why conflicts become forever wars. Why does the author suggest leaders make these choices, even if they seem ineffective in ending the conflict? What's the motivation presented?
Well, the source offers a rather cynical explanation, perhaps. It suggests leaders might make these restrictive or indecisive choices because they calculate that they might not be in power when the negative consequences fully materialize. Kicking the can down the road, essentially. They leave the eventual mess for their successors, the next president or leader.
So short-term thinking.
That's the implication. The source observes that, frustratingly, sometimes the next president or leader repeats the exact same flawed approach in the same conflict, continuing the cycle until eventually someone simply decides to cut losses and withdraw, often without achieving the original objectives.
Just give up and go home.
More or less. And this piece connects this observed lack of accountability, or competency, as it puts it, to a broader global trend. It argues that this pattern is now enabling other nations to increasingly fight their wars by proxy. The source suggests we see weaker forces openly backed by certain strong nations, while another stronger nation, hesitant to directly confront the backers, maybe to avoid escalating with a peer power, engages the weaker force using the same restricted, indecisive methods we've been discussing, never achieving a physical victory or forcing full capitulation.
Wow, okay. That brings together a lot of the points this source makes about the dynamics at play. Let's quickly summarize the key insights from this particular piece you shared with us. It offered a lot to think about.
Certainly. So, this source defines forever wars primarily by the lack of willingness to achieve the total destruction of the enemy, even when you have superior military strength. It draws a fundamental line between police work and military action, arguing the two are being disastrously confused in modern conflicts, according to this view.
Right, and it argues that factors like external criticism lead to restrictive rules of engagement, which this source contends prioritize appearances or political considerations over actually winning the war.
Exactly. Which then leads, the source claims, to a failure to consolidate gains after fighting. This allows enemies to simply return, leaves no lasting positive legacy, and also erodes credibility with potential allies abroad. They see you don't finish the job.
And the source flags various arguments used to justify these protracted conflicts, claiming concern for civilians while infrastructure remains intact, fighting only partial territories, and engaging in proxy battles to avoid direct confrontation with other major powers. Excuses, essentially, in this author's view.
Ultimately, the author links ineffective battlefield tactics and specific, seemingly illogical decisions like not destroying key bridges or imposing those restrictive rules on urban combat directly to prolonging conflicts unnecessarily.
Tying specific actions to the long duration.
Yes, and this piece attributes the continuation of these patterns and the rise of proxy wars to what it sees as a fundamental lack of accountability, where leaders aren't held responsible for the long-term negative outcomes of their decisions, perpetuating the cycle.
Okay. This deep dive into this source material has certainly offered a distinct and, frankly, critical perspective through which to view and understand reports on both current and past conflicts you might encounter.
It really forces you to look at the outcomes, doesn't it, and the process. The source explicitly states it sees history repeating itself and suggests that this lack of accountability is a key driver in other nations now fighting via proxy wars. So if you take this source's argument seriously, it leaves you wondering, does this pattern of forever wars inevitably mean that future conflicts will increasingly become these complex, protracted proxy battles, potentially fueled by a lack of consequence for those making the initial, perhaps indecisive decisions?